Not every death closes a life. Some deaths are simply doors, doors that open onto chains of events far greater than a single man, events that spill outward and become the destiny of entire lands. The death of Ragnar Lothbrok was such a death. It does not rest quietly on the page of a chronicle, nor can it be boxed in as a defeat or a conclusion. It was a spark struck at the driest point of European history, and once lit the fire, spread beyond anyone's ability to extinguish it. At the moment Ragnar died, Europe believed it was entering a fragile calm. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England trusted their stone walls, their churches, and the order they believed God himself had ordained. The Vikings, in their eyes, were still little more than raiders, men who came swiftly, took what they could, and vanished back into the salt-stained horizon. No one imagined that the death of a single northern warlord, no matter how famous, could shake the foundations of an entire continent. But Ragnar was no ordinary leader. He was not merely a man who carried an axe into battle. He was the living symbol of a Viking age on the rise. In the stories told beside northern hearth fires, Ragnar was the one who dared to challenge fate, who sailed farther than any before him, who laughed at death as if it were only an impatient guest who had arrived too early. Because of this, when he was captured and killed by Ivar, king of Northumbria, the act was not simply the removal of an enemy. It was a deliberate humiliation, a declaration that Viking legends could be broken, that the heroes of the North were nothing more than flesh and bone. Ivar believed he had sent a warning. If a man like Ragnar could be subdued, then any Viking could be made to bend. But in the cold logic of history, this was a fatal mistake. Some cultures see defeat as an ending. Others see it as an invitation to revenge. For the Vikings, honor does not die with the body. It is passed on like an unpaid debt from one generation to the next. Ragnar's death, therefore, did not close a story. It became a quiet curse. It did not explode immediately. No fleets were appearing. The next night, no frantic acts of retaliation. Instead, there was silence, a long silence, heavy, oppressive, and far more frightening than any scream. Within that silence in the north, Ragnar's sons received the news in their own way, not with tears, but with resolve taking shape. What made this death shake Europe was not a manner in which Ragnar died, but the inevitable consequences it set in motion. Ragnar died as an individual, but he left behind an unfinished legacy, uncompleted journeys, unrealized ambitions, and most importantly, a final prophecy, whispered like a challenge to his enemies. In Viking culture, a warrior's last words are not an echo that fades away. They are seeds planted in the future. In England, Ivar and the other kings failed to understand this. They were accustomed to believing that the death of a leader would shatter the forces beneath him. They did not see that in Ragnar's case, death did the opposite. It fused scattered ambitions into a single purpose. In the Viking world, Ragnar was no longer a man to mourn. He became a symbol whose honor demanded restoration. And once honor is violated, there is only one way to cleanse it. Revenge on a scale history cannot ignore. The important question then is not how Ragnar died, but why his death carried such destructive force. It struck at the precise intersection of several historical currents: the complacency of the English kingdoms, the quiet rise of Viking power, and a generation of sons unwilling to live in the shadow of a legend without turning it into action. Ragnar died at the exact moment Europe believed it understood its northern enemy, and that belief blinded it to the storm taking shape. Seen from a distance, Ragnar's death resembles the first stone pushed from a mountainside. The stone itself is small, but once it begins to roll, it drags an avalanche behind it. What followed was no longer within the control of any king. Stone walls, prayers, ancient treaties, all became fragile before a force born of memory and vengeance. Ragnar died, but his death was not a period. It was a colon. What followed was a longer, darker, far more violent sentence. A story Europe would pay dearly to understand, and by the time those living within it realized what had begun, It was already too late. The fire had been lit, the curse had been spoken, and history had begun to turn in a direction no one could foresee. The news did not arrive with shouting or chaos. It arrived quietly. A messenger stepped into the great hall, dropped to one knee on the cold wooden floor, and bowed his head low enough that he did not have to meet the faces seated around the table. No one urged him on. No one asked a question. Just one short sentence was spoken dry and blunt, like a blade striking stone. Ragnar is dead. In that moment, nothing happened the way people might expect. No crying, no curses, no one leapt to their feet. The room sank into silence, a silence so heavy it felt as though it could crush the lungs of everyone inside it. Outside, the northern wind swept over the longhouse roof, carrying the scent of salt and smoke. But inside, time itself seemed to stop. Ragnar's sons sat there, each locked in his own thoughts, yet bound by the same irreversible truth. Their father was dead, and he had not fallen like a warrior on the battlefield. He had died in the hands of an enemy in a way that honor would not allow to be forgotten. That was why the pain could not be released through tears. To them, crying was an admission of helplessness. And the sons of Ragnar were not allowed to be helpless. The silence stretched on, but it was not empty. It was dense with decisions taking shape. In their world, emotion does not vanish. It is compressed, forced inward, held tight until the moment it can erupt into action. That silence was more terrifying than any scream because it signaled a storm not yet revealed, a storm controlled, cultivated by cold will. Each son reacted differently, yet none reacted wrongly. One clenched his fists until blood surged to his fingertips, as if physical pain could keep the mind from shattering. Another stared at an invisible point on the table where old carvings recalled past victories, as though measuring the distance between former glory and present humiliation. And another, the one who seemed most detached, was in fact thinking the hardest, quietly assembling fragments of information into a coherent picture of the future. No one spoke the word revenge. There was no need. It hung in the air clearer than any oath. To them, revenge was not an emotional outburst. It was an obligation, a debt that had to be paid, not only for the dead, but for the order that his death had violated. If they failed to act, Ragnar's honor would rot in memory, and with it their own standing in the Viking world. What made this moment different was the absence of haste. A rushed revenge is a gift to the enemy. They understood that. Ragnar's sons were not men who simply swung axes in anger. They had been raised on stories of patience, of waiting for the right wind before raising the sail. And so instead of rushing into bloodshed, they chose the harder path, waiting and preparing. The silence in the great hall began to dissolve, not through words, but through movement. One man rose first, slowly, as though each step carried the weight of history. The others followed. No orders were shouted, yet everyone knew what had to be done. Messages would be sent, not as ordinary calls to arms, but as signals. Quiet messages to every harbor, every chieftain, every warrior who had ever heard the name Ragnar. The age of small raids was over. What was coming would be different. In that moment, Ragnar was still present, even though his body was gone. He lived on in the way his sons straightened their backs, in eyes that refused to bow to fate. His death did not weaken them. It forced them to grow up faster, to step out of their father's shadow, and become what history now demanded. They were no longer simply sons. They were heirs to a curse. Far to the south, where Anglo-Saxon kings believed the threat had been eliminated, no one sensed this shift. No armies gathered to signal danger. No cities were attacked in sudden fury. But that quiet was the most terrifying thing of all. It was like a calm sea before a storm, deceiving those who only knew how to look with ordinary eyes. Ragnar's sons understood that, to shake the world, they first had to let it fall asleep. They allowed their enemies to believe that Ragnar's death had closed an old chapter. Meanwhile, in the north, a new chapter was being written, not in ink, but in steel and memory. Every day that passed, In silence was another day, the debt of honor, accrued interest. As night fell, and the great hall was left, with only the flicker of firelight, none of them doubted the path ahead. They did not weep for their dead father, because tears could not bring him back. Instead, they did what they believed Ragnar would have wanted most. They turned his death into a reason for history to change course. And in that cold silence, a decision was made. No oath was needed, no witnesses required. The revenge had begun, even though not a single drop of blood had yet been spilled. The decision was made in silence, but its consequences were anything but quiet. From scattered harbors across the north, a movement began, slow, deliberate, and irreversible. There was no formal proclamation. No single leader rose to rally the masses. There were only ships being refitted, hulls, reinforced sails, stitched thicker, and families preparing for a journey they understood would not end any time soon. This was not preparation for a raid. This was preparation for departure. The Anglo-Saxons were accustomed to Vikings appearing like a summer storm, sudden, violent, and gone as quickly as they arrived. This time, none of the familiar signs appeared. There were no early isolated attacks, no rumors of small raiding bands. Instead, there was an unsettling absence of information, as if the North itself were holding its breath. Within that void, what history would later call the Great Heathen Army was taking shape. Calling it an army was not enough. An army comes to fight and then withdraws. What was gathering across the sea had no intention of leaving. It resembled an armed migration, a community carrying war as a basic necessity. There were not only warriors. Blacksmiths brought anvils and hammers. Women prepared food and tended to children. Horses were loaded onto ships, a rare and dangerous undertaking, signaling that this was not about a single battle, but about the lands that would follow. This difference marked the true historical turning point. Before, Vikings came to take what already existed. This time they came to create a new order. They were not interested in impoverishing an enemy for a single season, but in seizing resources to sustain themselves for years. That required a scale never before attempted, and more importantly, a unifying purpose strong enough to bind together people who were otherwise accustomed to fighting one another over honor and territory. The death of Ragnar became that purpose. It pushed old rivalries aside, at least temporarily. Leaders who had once been enemies now sat at the same table, not because trust had suddenly formed, but because they understood this opportunity would never come again. Avenging Ragnar was not only a moral obligation, it was the perfect justification for a conquest that would otherwise have seemed reckless. When the ships finally left their harbors, they did not scatter as they had in the past. They moved together first in clusters, then in vast, unbroken lines stretching across the sea. This was not the image of solitary predators. It was a wave, and that wave carried an unspoken message. This was not a short journey. This was a transfer of power. On the far shore, the people of East Anglia were the first to sense that something was wrong. They had seen Viking ships before, but never a horizon darkened by masts. What approached did not feel like a familiar threat. It felt like a natural force, a black tide, indifferent to walls and prayers alike. And most terrifying of all, it was not in a hurry. The great host came ashore and stopped. It did not strike immediately. It did not burn without reason. Camps were built, positions organized, observations made. That patience shattered every assumption the Anglo-Saxons held. They could not understand what their enemy was doing and therefore could not decide how to respond. In war, nothing is more dangerous than an enemy you cannot predict. Here lay the true turning point. From this moment on, England was no longer facing raids, but a new political and military entity. The Great Heathen Army did not behave like thieves, but like settlers with swords. They demanded resources not to fill ship holds, but to sustain a permanent presence. They spoke of winter, of feeding men and horses, of inland routes and supply lines. This was the language of people who intended to stay. The Anglo-Saxon kings, accustomed to crises that came and went, failed to adapt. They believed that if they endured one season, paid tribute, or held their defenses long enough, the enemy would grow tired and leave. But this army did not tire. It was built on the assumption that exhaustion was something to overcome, not a reason to stop. With every day it remained unchallenged, it sank deeper roots into the land. From the perspective of history, this was the moment Viking warfare shifted from tactics to strategy. No longer a series of battles for immediate plunder, but a calculated sequence designed to reshape an entire region. The presence of women and children was not a sign of weakness. It was a declaration of long-term intent. They carried their future with them, and they meant to plant it here. As the Great Heathen Army settled in and waited, it did not wait only for military response. It waited for fear to spread. Each silent day forced English kingdoms to question whether their walls were high enough, whether their alliances were strong enough. And while those questions remained unanswered, the army achieved its most important objective. It changed the nature of the conflict itself. From this point forward, there was no return to the old order. The ships that carried the Vikings here brought more than warriors. They carried a new way of thinking about war and power. That is why the Great Heathen Army was never just an army. It was the beginning of an era, one in which war was no longer a passing storm, but the new climate of an entire land. If the Great Heathen Army was a body in motion, then Ivar was its brain. Not the heart, not the arm that swung the axe, but the thing buried deep inside, cold calculating and never allowing emotion to divert the course of the objective. While others carried a burning rage over Ragnar's death, Ivar carried something far more dangerous: certainty. Ivar did not see his father's death as a tragedy to be mourned. He saw it as a data point, a fixed variable, unchangeable, and therefore usable. Where others saw loss, Ivar saw an opportunity to rearrange the entire board. That was what set him apart and what made him terrifying. From a very young age, Ivar understood that his body was not like that of other men. He could not rely on raw strength. He could not charge into the shield wall with axe raised high. That limitation, rather than weakening him, forced him to develop a weapon no one could ever take away his mind. In a Viking world, where reputation was measured by the number of enemies slain, Ivar learned to measure power by the ability to make the enemy defeat himself. Ivar viewed people as unsolved equations. Each individual was a collection of motives, fears, ambitions, and weaknesses. To him, war did not begin when two armies collided, but at the moment the enemy believed they understood you. And Ivar's task was to turn that belief into a fatal mistake. He did not need to kill the most men. He only needed to kill the right ones at the right moment in the right way to create a chain reaction. During long nights in the camp, while others drank and spoke of glory yet to come, Ivar lay awake thinking, not about the next battle, but about what would follow it. If this city fell, who would panic first? If that king were humiliated instead of killed, how would his allies respond? Every decision was weighed not for speed, but for irreversibility. There were thoughts no chronicle ever recorded, because they were too cold, too practical for heroic legend. Ivar understood that fear lasts longer than respect. A man may respect an enemy today and challenge him tomorrow, but a man shaped by fear passes it on to his children. And so Ivar's goal was not merely victory, it was memory. Memory that would change how an entire land saw the world. In Ivar's eyes, his father was not only a man to be avenged, but the perfect psychological anchor for legitimizing conquest. Ragnar's death allowed Ivar to cloak every coming action in moral justification among the Vikings. Yet Ivar knew deep down that this war was not truly about Ragnar. It was about proving that power did not have to come from physical strength, that a sufficiently sharp mind could bend the fate of kingdoms. Ivar also understood how often men misjudge others by appearances. A man who could not stand firm in battle was assumed to be weak. Ivar exploited that assumption, allowing enemies to believe they faced a divided alliance where only the strong brothers mattered. Meanwhile, every meaningful decision passed through him. The man who never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. His authority lay in the quiet realization shared by those around him that every road to victory had already been drawn. Ivar's greatest obsession was not death, but waste. He despised meaningless battles, losses that served no greater purpose. Every fallen warrior was a resource squandered one that could have been used more effectively. This made him willing to do what others called cruel or cowardly, avoiding combat when the same outcome could be achieved through psychological pressure or political manipulation. To Ivar, the morality of war lay not in how it was fought, but in how it ended. Perhaps the most frightening thing about Ivar was his lack of personal hatred. He did not need to despise his enemies to destroy them. Hatred only clouded judgment. He could speak calmly, politely, even to men whose fates he had already decided. To him, people were pieces on a board expendable, so long as the game concluded as intended. As the Great Heathen Army stood at the threshold of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, it was this way of thinking that shaped every step forward. No haste, no recklessness, only deliberate movement, forcing the enemy to respond along paths already anticipated. What followed was not a series of random battles, but a sequence of correct answers to a problem Ivar had solved long before. History often remembers heroes for their strength, but rarely acknowledges the minds that quietly redirected the course of an age. Ivar was one of those minds. He did not need to be loved. He only needed to be feared. And as the wheel of history began to turn faster under his guidance, there was no longer any doubt that the Great Heathen Army was driven not by rage, but by a merciless intellect. Every road taken by the Great Heathen Army ultimately led to a single name. York, not because it was the richest city, nor because it was the most heavily fortified, but because its meaning went far beyond geography. York was the heart of Northumbria, the symbol of Anglo-Saxon authority in the north. To strike York was not merely to attack a city. It was to strike at the belief that the old order still stood firm. In the year 866, when the Great Heathen Army began shifting its focus northward from East Anglia, many assumed this was nothing more than a routine movement of war. But to Ivar, the boneless York was never just a military objective. It was an experiment, a test designed to measure how fear could be created, controlled, and exploited. Ivar understood Northumbria's internal fractures better than its own rulers. The kingdom was being torn apart by a bitter power struggle between King Aella and his rival Osbert. The two factions hated each other so completely that they failed to see the real danger, one approaching silently from across the sea. To Ivar, this was not chaos to be feared, but a rare gift. An enemy that divides itself before being struck has already lost half the battle. The army approached York in late autumn of 866. The timing was deliberate. November 1st, All Saints' Day, a sacred date in the Anglo-Saxon calendar, when nobles, clergy, and military leaders gathered inside churches, weapons set aside, minds fixed on prayer. Ivar did not need to challenge their faith. He only needed to step through it at precisely the right moment. York fell quickly, not because its walls were weak, but because the blow landed directly on the mind. The church bells had barely stopped ringing when the gates were breached. There was no grand heroic clash, only the collapse of a sense of safety. And most importantly, Ivar forbade pointless destruction. York was left intact. The decision shocked many within the army, but it fit perfectly within the logic of the experiment. York was not burned, it was occupied. Storehouses were seized. The old Roman walls were repaired. The city was transformed into a Viking fortress deep inside hostile territory. With that single act, Ivar delivered the first message of his psychological war. We are not here to destroy your world. We are here to live in it. From York, Ivar waited, not for reinforcements, but for reaction. He knew Aella and Osbert could not ignore the loss of their capital. He also knew that pride and mutual hatred would delay their response longer than it should. With every passing day, the image of the Great Heathen Army seated upon the throne of Northumbria carved itself deeper into the public consciousness. The old order had been breached, and everyone knew it. By early 867, the inevitable occurred. Aella and Osbert finally set aside their feud. Two enemies joined hands for a single cause, reclaiming York. To them it was a holy war before the word itself existed. To Ivar, it was simply the next phase of the experiment. On March 21st, 867 Palm Sunday, the combined Northumbrian forces attacked. From the outside, it looked like victory was within reach. Anglo-Saxon troops broke through sections of the defenses and poured into the city. Cheers echoed through York's narrow streets, but this was the moment Ivar had been waiting for. York was not an open battlefield. It was a maze. Ivar had not lost the city. He had withdrawn deliberately, guiding the enemy inward. As the bulk of the Anglo-Saxon army was drawn into tight streets and confined spaces, their formations collapsed. Their numerical advantage and long spears became useless. And when the doors closed behind them, the trap was sprung. This was not uncontrolled slaughter. It was a managed collapse. Both Northumbrian kings fell amid the chaos, not as heroic martyrs, but as symbols of an outdated order. The Battle of York did not end with celebration, but with a different kind of silence, heavier, final, undeniable. What made York a psychological strike rather than merely a military one was how Ivar used the victory. He did not pursue the fleeing remnants. He did not need to. The story spread on its own. Neighboring kingdoms heard not of casualty numbers, but of how a sacred city had been turned into a weapon. York became proof that walls, rituals, and last-minute alliances were no longer enough to protect them. After York, fear ceased to be an immediate reaction. It became a permanent condition. Kings no longer asked how to defeat the Great Heathen Army. They asked whether it was even wise to confront it at all. That was Ivar's greatest victory. He had not merely defeated an army. He had changed how an entire land thought about war. From that moment on, York was more than an occupied city. It was a living warning, a trap that had closed not only on a battlefield, but inside the minds of all England. And once fear had been proven to be something that could be engineered and repeated, Ivar knew his experiment had succeeded. From then on, the question was no longer one of strength, but of who possessed the courage to challenge a merciless mind. After York, the war could have ended favorably. A king was killed, a city fallen. The victors celebrated, while the defeated retreated into shadow. But for the Great Heathen Army, York was only a doorway. What they pursued was not the bodies left in the streets, but something far more intangible, an order of honor that had been violated and now had to be restored on their terms. In the Viking world, killing an enemy was not always the harshest punishment. Death, if delivered properly, could be an escape. It closed the debt between the two sides. Humiliation was different. Humiliation prolonged the debt, allowed it to multiply, and spread, forcing the offended party or their bloodline to act to restore balance. Ragnar's death, in the eyes of his sons, was not merely a loss. It was a breach of the unwritten laws of war. And once those laws were broken, they demanded correction at a fitting price. That is why when Aella was captured after the Battle of York in 867, the question was never whether he should die, but how he should die so that the order of honor could be repaired. In Anglo-Saxon thinking, the execution of a king was an ending. In Viking thinking, it mattered only if it reflected the nature of the crime. And Aella's crime, as they saw it, was not killing Ragnar, but how he had done it by denying him the right to die as a warrior. To the Vikings, justice was not blind. It had memory. It remembered details, contexts, and intentions. An action carried consequences, not simply because it occurred, but because of the message it sent. When Aella believed he was delivering a warning, he never imagined that the message would be read in an entirely different way in the north. And when he was brought before Ragnar's sons, He was no longer a king. He became the embodiment of an insult that had to be answered. In those moments, Ivar the Boneless did not behave like a man consumed by hatred. He was colder than ever. For Ivar, this was not a moment for emotional release, but a critical opportunity to deliver the final lesson of his experiment. A lesson not meant for Aella alone, but for every remaining king in England. The lesson was simple. Some boundaries cannot be crossed without consequence, and Viking honor is not something that can be violated without cost. The price of humiliation, therefore, was not measured in lives taken. It was measured in the inversion of symbolic order. A king who had believed himself above all law was reduced to a figure meant to bear consequences in full view of the world, not to satisfy a crowd, but to carve the message into collective memory. In Viking thought, justice was only complete once it had been witnessed and remembered. This was nearly impossible for the Anglo-Saxons to comprehend. In their world, law was tied to the church, to written codes, to standards taught from the pulpit. In the Viking world, law was bound to action and consequence. No elaborate explanation was required. The act itself was the verdict, and that verdict was aimed not at the soul, but at the structure of society. After Aella's death, the Great Heathen Army did not pause to celebrate. There was no triumph, no sense of closure. Instead, the camp grew quieter, as though a ritual had just been completed. The debt of honor had been paid, but its consequences were only beginning to spread. News of Aella's fate did not travel as a tale of victory, but as a warning, and that warning reached other kingdoms with alarming speed. In East Anglia, where safety had once been purchased, with tribute fear began to take tangible shape. In Mercia, advisors whispered about whether confrontation was even possible. The death of a king was no longer seen as a personal tragedy, but as a signal that the rules had changed. This was no longer a war where the defeated could beg for mercy under old assumptions. This difference in the concept of justice is what gave the conflict its deeper gravity. The Vikings did not impose their law through documents. They imposed it through precedent. Each action established a new standard, forcing others to adjust their behavior if they wished to survive. It was a form of rule built on collective memory, where fear and respect blended so closely they became difficult to separate. Within that logic, vengeance for Ragnar had long ceased to be personal. It became a tool for restructuring power across England, a new order in which insults were no longer trivial, and kings were no longer shielded by their titles. Those who violated the law of honor would pay in a way the entire world would remember. After York and the price of humiliation, the Great Heathen Army was no longer merely an invading force. It became the new measure of consequence. And once that measure was set, the remaining kingdoms faced a choice: adapt to the new order or become the next example in a sequence of lessons Ivar had calculated long before any of this began. After York and the price of humiliation, war entered a different state. It was no longer a sequence of battles proven by steel crashing against steel. From that moment on, the Great Heathen Army no longer needed to move faster, strike harder, or grow larger. They only needed to exist. Their very presence, combined with what had already been witnessed, was enough to destabilize kingdoms before a single spear was thrown. Fear began to travel faster than armies. It needed no ships, no horses. It moved through rumors, through refugees, through merchants who abandoned their routes, through priests whispering inside churches. The story of York was not told as a military defeat, but as the collapse of an old logic. If Northumbria, with its walls and traditions, could not stand then, who could? In East Anglia, memories of the compromise made 3 years earlier returned to haunt the kingdom. Their king Edmund, the martyr, had once believed peace could be bought with tribute. But that kind of peace exists only as long as the stronger side accepts the rules. For the Great Heathen Army, the rules had changed. When they returned in 869, they did not come to ask for more. They came to take everything. Edmund faced an uneven choice: fight a hopeless war, or submit and lose what he believed defined a king. Edmund chose death, not because he believed he could win, but because he believed there were limits that could not be crossed without losing one's meaning. To him, surrender was not just the loss of a kingdom, but the abandonment of faith and identity. In Viking eyes, this was stubbornness. In the eyes of history, it was a choice born of fear yet shaped by belief. Edmund became a symbol of a form of resistance that was militarily ineffective, but morally weighty. The opposite choice was made by Burgred, king of Mercia. Mercia had once been one of the most powerful kingdoms in central England, rich in resources and population. But Burgred saw what many others refused to admit. His sword could not cut through the fear that had spread across the land. He saw the fate of Aella. He saw the death of Edmund. And he understood that, if he fought, Mercia might become the next example. Burgred did not choose death. He chose flight. In 874, as the Great Heathen Army pushed deep into Mercian territory and established a camp at Repton, Burgred abandoned his throne, took what gold he could carry, and fled to Rome, where he would die in exile. In the logic of ancient warfare, this was cowardice. In the logic of fear, it was survival. Burgred was not defeated by Viking swords. He was defeated by the realization that this war left no room for half measures. These two opposing choices, death and flight, clearly reflected the transformation of war in this period. Once fear reached a certain threshold, people no longer responded according to heroic instinct or inherited duty. They responded in whatever way they believed would hurt the least, even if the cost was reputation, faith, or an entire dynasty. What is striking is that the Great Heathen Army did not need to force these choices directly. They issued no elaborate ultimatums. They did not threaten each kingdom in turn. Each previous example spoke for itself. The fates of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia formed a chain of logic that no remaining king could ignore. If you fought, you might die like Edmund. If you fled, you might live like Burgred, but lose everything. And if you hesitated, you would be pulled into the spiral without time to choose at all. Fear thus became the most effective strategic weapon of Ivar and his brothers. It was cheaper than war, faster than war, and far less costly to them than war. A kingdom that collapsed from fear often left its infrastructure intact, ready to be taken over. A kingdom fought to destruction left only ashes behind. Ivar understood this, and he allowed fear to do the heaviest work. By the middle of the 870s, the map of England had changed dramatically. Northumbria became a land under Viking influence. East Anglia died with its king. Mercia survived in name, only no longer an independent force. None of this happened because the Great Heathen Army won a constant series of decisive battles, but because they won in the minds of their enemies before fighting began. The spread of fear also distorted relationships among the remaining kingdoms. Allies grew suspicious of one another. Promises of support became vague. Every ruler wondered whether he would be the next target, and whether helping another might only draw attention sooner. Fear, once planted correctly, does more than weaken enemies. It isolates them. In this landscape, only one kingdom had not yet fallen. Wessex in the south watched the lessons from the north with mounting dread. What followed would no longer be a question of who was stronger, but of who truly understood the nature of this new kind of war. And when the Great Heathen Army finally turned its gaze toward Wessex, they carried more than swords and shields. They carried something far more dangerous, the reputation of those who had made entire kingdoms collapse through fear alone. When the gaze of the Great Heathen Army finally turned south, many believed the story was about to repeat itself. Another kingdom would panic. Another king would be forced to choose between an honorable death and a shameful escape. But in Wessex, they did not find another Aella, nor an Edmund ready to sacrifice himself for a symbol. Instead, they encountered someone entirely different, Alfred the Great, who at that time bore no such title and was not even regarded as a true warrior. Alfred did not enter history with the clash of swords. He entered it quietly, almost unnoticed. In the court of Wessex, he had long been overshadowed by a stronger brother, by commanders hardened by battle. His body was frail, plagued by illness, leading many to believe he might not survive the hardships of life itself, let alone stand against the most terrifying army in Europe. But precisely because he was not a hero cut from the usual mold, Alfred saw war differently. He did not view what had happened in Northumbria, East Anglia, or Mercia as tragedies belonging to others. He treated them as data. Every fallen kingdom was a lesson. Every fatal decision made by northern kings was a warning. And the most important lesson Alfred learned was this: the great heathen army did not win through brute strength alone. They won because their enemies reacted exactly as they had been expected to. When Ivar the Boneless and his brothers pushed into Wessex in the early 870s, brutal fighting erupted around Reading and nearby regions. Neither side achieved a decisive victory. Blood was spilled freely, losses were heavy, and for the first time since York, the great heathen army faced an opponent who did not immediately collapse under fear. Yet Alfred understood that he could not defeat them through confrontation forever. These battles were not victories. They were measurements. In 871, when his brother died, and Alfred unwillingly inherited the crown amid the smoke of war, many believed Wessex was finished. A young sickly king stood against an army that had shattered nearly all of England. But Alfred did not do what fear usually compels men to do. He did not flee, nor did he rush into a suicidal battle to die with honor. He did the one thing no one expected. He negotiated. Alfred's decision to pay the great heathen army to withdraw was widely condemned as cowardice, but that judgment belonged to those who still believed war was decided only on the battlefield. Alfred saw further. He understood that time was the most valuable resource of all, and that it favored whoever knew how to use it. By purchasing a pause, he gained what no other kingdom had secured: the chance to change the rules of the game. In the relatively quiet years that followed, Alfred did not rest. He studied how the Vikings moved, how they organized their forces, and how they controlled and conquered territory. He learned from his enemy. Fortified towns, burhs, began to rise across Wessex, forming a defensive network no kingdom had previously imagined. A navy was built not for reckless attack, but to disrupt the enemy's mobility. What truly set Alfred apart was not these reforms, but their pace. He did not attempt everything at once. He advanced patiently, step by step, as though drawing a bowstring back and waiting for the precise moment to release it. Meanwhile, the great heathen army, accustomed to enemies collapsing quickly, entered a state they rarely encountered, delay that fear could not break. Here the core question of the war began to surface. Who was truly winning? The one who seized the most land in the shortest time, or the one who endured long enough to reshape the future? The great heathen army had won great battles. They had spread fear across England. But to Alfred, victory was not measured by today's map, but by the power to shape tomorrow. Alfred did not deny the strength of his enemy. He respected it, and that respect prevented him from underestimating what he faced. He knew that defeating an enemy like Ivar required more than courage. It required memory. Remembering everything that had happened in the north, and ensuring that Wessex did not repeat those mistakes. As the great heathen army continued to disperse to manage the lands they had taken, Alfred quietly laid the foundations for a counterstroke no one could yet see. He did not need to be the man who frightened his enemies immediately. He only needed to be the one man who did not fear them. And in a world accustomed to kingdoms collapsing because fear spread faster than armies, that calm became the most dangerous weapon of all. Most contemporaries failed to recognize this. They saw only a young king paying for survival. But history, looking back, would ask a different question. Not who won the most battles, but who understood that war was a long game. And when that question is asked, Alfred emerges not as a born hero, but as the man who waited long enough to turn patience into victory. The revenge began with a death, but it did not end in victory. At least not the kind of victory the people of that age could immediately recognize. When the last swords were returned to their scabbards, when the sails no longer darkened the horizon, what remained was not the silence of the defeated, but a world altered so deeply it could never return to what it had been. For Ragnar's sons, the debt had been paid. Those responsible for the humiliation had answered for it. Kingdoms that once dismissed Viking power had tasted its consequences. On a personal level, on the level of honor, the revenge was complete. But history does not care who feels satisfied. It cares about outcomes, and the outcome of this revenge far exceeded the intentions of those who first set it in motion. When Ivar the Boneless vanished from English records, around the year 870, many believed it meant the storm had passed. Perhaps he had died elsewhere. Perhaps he had withdrawn to rule the lands already taken. Whatever the reason, his absence marked a turning point. The Great Heathen Army was no longer a single body guided by one mind. It scattered, settled, and took root. And in that fragmentation, history began to write a new chapter. The northern and eastern lands of England did not return fully to Anglo-Saxon control. Instead, they became a hybrid space where Viking law language and customs blended with local traditions. This region would later be known as the Danelaw. It was not an occupation in the temporary sense, but a place where two worlds learned to coexist, sometimes through conflict, sometimes through compromise. The Vikings did not merely stay. They farmed the land, traded, and married. Norse names embedded themselves into the English landscape, preserved in place names that would endure for centuries. New legal practices emerged neither fully Viking nor fully Anglo-Saxon. A revenge born from personal honor had unintentionally created a new social structure, one in which difference was not erased, but forced to live side by side. In the South, Alfred the Great continued along the path he had chosen: patience and construction. When the moment came, he struck back not to erase Viking influence, but to contain and shape it. Treaties were signed, boundaries drawn. Alfred did not attempt to turn time backward to a world before the invasion. He understood that it was impossible. Instead, he sought to build a new order capable of enduring within a transformed reality. Here, the question of who won becomes more complex than ever. The Vikings won because they seized land, spread influence, and reshaped England's political map. Alfred won because he preserved Wessex and laid the foundations of a kingdom capable of absorbing historical shock and turning it into strength. But above all, history won because it chose no side. It simply accumulated consequences. The revenge of Ragnar's sons did not end in the destruction of one side. It ended in fusion. And that fusion, unforeseen by anyone at the time, proved the most enduring result of all. From conflict came convergence. From violence came a new order. It is a paradox invisible to those who lived through it, but one that later generations would inhabit every day. Ragnar died as a man, but the revenge carried in his name exceeded the limits of a human life. It shattered old kingdoms, but it also forced communities to adapt. It generated fear, but it also compelled leaders like Alfred to think differently, to build, rather than merely react. England was no longer a loose collection of easily divided realms. From ruin and compromise alike, a new idea began to take shape, an England capable of surviving in a world of greater powers. The echoes of this revenge lasted for centuries. The legends of Ragnar and his sons continued to be told, not only as tales of blood and steel, but as reminders that human actions often produce consequences far beyond their original purpose. No one in that great hall, when the news first arrived, could have imagined that the decision not to weep, but to act, would lead to the restructuring of an entire land. Revenge in this story is not an ending. It is a catalyst. It burns away what has decayed, but it also heats the raw material needed to forge something new. The world born from it belongs neither fully to the Vikings nor fully to the Anglo-Saxons. It is the product of both, shaped by choices driven by hatred, fear, and at rare moments, wisdom. When history closes the chapter of revenge and opens the chapter of endurance, one truth becomes clear. No one ever truly controls the outcome. Ragnar's sons achieved what they sought, but they also created a world their descendants would have to learn how to live in. And in that world, a new England emerged not as the prize of a victor, but as the inevitable result of a conflict that had grown far beyond anyone's original design.